Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's book talk event, hosted by the Columbia Weatherhead East Asian Institute, co-sponsored by the China Center for Social Policy and the Columbia and Harvard China and the World program. My name is Qing Gao. I'm a professor at Columbia School of Social Work, also director of China Center for Social Policy and a faculty member at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. It's my great honor to open today's event. I think we all are fortunate to have survived COVID, this pandemic, and still to experience the aftermath in all regards in our lives every day. COVID seems to have blurred some timelines and spaces for us, but in some other regards, COVID has made those times and spaces more distinct for all of us. Today is March 21st. 4 years ago, March 23rd in New York City started lockdown. And it was the epicenter of COVID worldwide here in New York. And before that, for time, Italy was the epicenter. And then before that, Wuhan. So today we are going to go all the way back to the beginning to talk about Wuhan, the outbreak of COVID, brought to us by Professor Dali L, who is brave and hardworking to write this book for us. So I now turn it over to my colleague, Professor Junyan Jiang, to introduce Professor Yang and moderate today's talk. Welcome and thank you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And I think the sheer amount of turnout, tell us how much we're interested in this topic and how profoundly important this topic is, and how important COVID has been for us. I mean, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Dali L, and for those who don't know, Professor Yang is actually my dissertation advisor when I was in Chicago. Rarely do you have the chance in your career that you can actually introduce your dissertation advisor, so I consider that as a professional success. So for those who don't know, you should know Professor Yang, but if you don't know, Professor Yang is the William C. Reavis Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He is the top-notch expert on China in this country, if not the in the world. His research focuses primarily on the development, governance, and the global influence of China. He's the author of numerous books and articles on China. Among them, his first book is on calamity and the reform, talking about the causes and consequences of Great Leap Forward. And his second book, Remaking Chinese Leviathan, is a book about a series of regulatory reforms that China undertook in the 2000s, creating the modern state that China has today. Right? And today, Professor Yang is going to share with us, his research on his most recent book on COVID, and how COVID started and spiraled out of control from Wuhan. And as I mentioned, this is a topic that all of us are very intrigued and very interested in, something that profoundly affected the lives of everyone, not only in the room but also around the world. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Professor Yang and let him talk about his book. Professor, how much time do you think you need?
I am told I have about 40 minutes or so.
So Professor Yang will talk about 40 minutes, and then we will have my other colleague, Professor Xiaobo from Barnard, to give some discussion remarks, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So please, Professor Yang.
Yeah, I do have a few pictures to share.
Should we move to the side?
Oh, that's right. That's good. Oh, all right. I mean, yeah. Oh, okay. I got it. Actually, yeah. It's. Oh, that's right. Okay. We do have some technical adjustments. Oh, okay, great. Well, again, thank you, Professor Gao, and also for Junyan for the introduction, very kind introduction. It's truly a great pleasure to be back in New York and to be able to walk around a little bit as well. And of course, to share, of course, if you are the dissertation advisor, in order to be introduced by your former student, you actually have to work. So that's the challenge in a way, especially when you have incredibly productive former students who are faculty members. But of course, we have all gone through COVID. The pandemic is actually not over. It's the emergency that has been over, but the pandemic actually is very much around still. And I see some of you are wearing face masks, and that's a good thing, I think, actually. Now, for this, I don't want to go too much into the writing of the book at this moment, and I would be glad to speak about it later on. I want to go straight to actually sort of what this book is about. Actually, there are a number of purposes, and depending on the reader, you may have different takes from the book. The first thing that I am trying to do is actually the first thing I want to do is actually to be able to document what happened. And one of the challenges about China is actually a lot of information that used to exist online, for example, have disappeared. Some information that continue to exist, and you may have not noticed it, but they may have been modified in ways that favor certain views, and so on. So in that sense, actually, as a scholar, and we have a special obligation to record history in a way that actually so sort of others may dislike to some extent as well. The second aspect is really to revisit what happened in a way to think about the decision-making. So this is really very much a book about decision-making, and especially in a multi-level, complicated bureaucracy, but in a way, in a time-pressed manner, emergency. And it's very difficult to do so. People who deal with public health know it's difficult, certainly. So sort of, I don't want to actually, so we shouldn't have that the view of perfection for any country in that regard, right? Number three is also clearly when you have what happened and so on, then what can we learn? And to what extent that also means there is actually this inevitable question: was the pandemic preventable, right? And what can we learn from it? And what can we do about the next one? And next ones in many ways, because the WHO, the World Health Assembly at this point, for example, are debating and discussing about the signing of a pandemic treaty at this very moment, in fact. Now, I do want to bring us back to actually 2019, Director General Gao Fu, whose name many of you are very familiar, actually, so sort of Oxford-educated virologist, one of the truly a leading virologist in the world, and he became the Director General of the China CDC in 2017. And here is actually something that people paid a lot of attention to in the early phases of the pandemic. In March 2019, he was asked, would something like SARS that happened in China in 2003, could that happen again? And he was emphatic, and I want to read this. And basically he says, SARS-like viruses can appear at any time. However, I'm very confident to say that the SARS-like events, in other words, the crisis that had happened in 2003, will not occur again in China, he meant. Clearly, because the infectious disease surveillance network system of our country is well established, and such events will not happen again. He had a good reason, actually, to be optimistic, certainly. Let's see. Now I have because number one, immediately following SARS, the Chinese government invested heavily developed a fairly strong health emergency regime, including the establishment of what is known as a national disease reporting network that was supposed to empower clinicians, public health specialists, and local hospitals to input data on new cases of infectious diseases into a national network so that they can be monitored from Beijing 24/7 in a way. So this system, which also included PUE and, for example, a pneumonia of uncertain etiology, but it certainly began incorporated SARS. Although this is actually, there is a long story that but I simply want to bracket that China kept the old name for SARS, 非典型肺炎, just like today, COVID in China continues to be called 新冠. So you do wonder when the next 新冠 comes, what would it be called actually? So sort of but certainly there was the advance in disease reporting institutions. There was a lot of development in science as well, genomic sequencing and so on, right? So sort of technologies. And also the development of a large number of commercial diagnostic companies, for example, BGI, which has actually become very prominent. And at the same time, China, over that period, had established, developed, and experienced quite a number of actually sort of new infectious diseases, especially in human avian influenzas, especially, for example, H7N9 was significant. H1N1 was actually, there was the international development. China participated in the Ebola missions, and in fact was one of the first countries, really the only country to develop a vaccine for Ebola, in fact. And in fact, in 2019, the National Health Commission convened a nationwide exercise to plan for the next infectious disease outbreak. And the imagined outbreak was a novel coronavirus. Moreover, and this is actually interesting for many, some of you may know, because of the planning for the World Military Games in Wuhan, Wuhan held its own health emergency exercise, and that imagined disease was also a novel coronavirus. But however, the Chinese, the experts tended to think the novel coronavirus would come from abroad, because MERS was figured prominently in the past. So in other words, China had developed significant capabilities. Wuhan in particular is well known for its biosafety lab. It's had major strength in health and medicine, and especially coronavirus research. So in other words, Gao Fu's optimism about preventing the next SARS wasn't exactly out of nowhere. He had good reason. But at the same time, we know that Wuhan began to respond to the outbreak at the end of December 2019, but it was not until January 20th, despite rumors that there was a novel coronavirus, that the Dr. Zhong Nanshan was allowed to go on national television to say there was human-to-human transmission, whose language is a very interesting thing in outbreaks. And I'll try to come back to this issue, but clearly he didn't simply mean human-to-human transmission. He really meant the severity of the transmission was significant by January 20th, in fact. So it's a few days later, Wuhan, a cordon sanitaria was imposed on Wuhan, in fact. So like many of you, I had puzzles about what happened. Because especially we all knew there were doctors such as Dr. Li Wenliang, but others who were shut up, right? There was significant information. So I really wanted to know in the process what actually happened. And in an outbreak, what is crucial, the coin of the realm, the most important factor is really what information was available, what decision makers had, and what did they do about that information, right? So the issue of what, when, how, and what was done about it, essentially. So in the end, it turned out this is a book about the politics of epidemic information processing throughout this throughout this period is essentially. And I do have the map of the major hospitals in Wuhan and so on. We'll come back to this, but a number of those hospitals in Wuhan are national level, top 10 hospitals. There are at least 2 of them. In fact, maybe 3. And of course, the Junyan Hospital, the infectious disease hospital, is at the very top of the map there. And the Huanan seafood market, the blue dot, is pretty much in the middle there. It turned out, in the process of digging this up, the information, officially, Dr. Zhang Jixian to the left is the doctor that reported the first cluster of cases. I do want you to remember Dr. Jiang's name because it will be significant later on. It turned out Dr. Jiang was not the only doctor who reported the first cases, actually, but Dr. Jiang reported 7 cases. The first 3 cases was actually on December 27th. And then on December 29th, she wasn't satisfied with the response. She advocated, and her hospital, the Hubei Provincial Hospital of Integrated Chinese and Western Medicine, escalated all the way to the Provincial Health Commission and reported 7 cases. The first 3 cases actually were a family of 3, 2 elderly parents and adult child, really adult. They had no exposure to the Huanan seafood market. Keep that in your mind, actually. But 7 cases just from this one hospital from the first report. It turned out already on December 27th, there were a number of other hospitals that had also reported. For example, to the right is Dr. Zhao Jianping, who would later become the leading expert for Hubei in responding to the outbreak as a clinician. She also started to report on December 27th, but you would not hear much about it, actually. So he would play a significant role. But for the moment, just remember there were multiple doctors who reported, and they reported because of a number of factors. Number one, for Dr. Zhang Jixian, she saw the symptoms as SARS-like symptoms. Those manifestations were important for her because she was experienced during SARS, so she wanted to report. For Dr. Zhao Jianping, one of the leading respiratory doctors in China, he not only saw the symptoms, by the evening of December 27th, he also had access to diagnostic results that showed a genomic sequence indicating actually a SARS-like coronavirus. So he not only actually had symptoms, he actually had serious, really actually much more information as a result. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot about these details, but this is actually on January 1st. The doctor to the right of this picture is actually Dr. Zhao Jianping at Junyan Hospital. By then, more than actually maybe 30 plus patients had been moved to the Junyan Hospital. Exact number, I'm not entirely sure. The first family, for example, only there are 2 elderly parents were moved over there. But remember, they had no exposure to the Huanan market, actually. Now, for Dr. Zhao, who later recalled, the severity of the situation was 28 of the leading experts in the province of Hubei were gathered at the Wuhan Junyan Hospital to consult collectively about 27 patients. Whenever something like that happens, you know, this is really, really serious, right? They would not want to bring so many experts from multiple fields, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to come in to consult on what was happening. And the reason the institute was brought in was that that institute was asked to assess the genomic information, actually, as well. Incidentally, Dr. Zhao later on was one of the first to emphasize that there was asymptomatic transmission. We, unfortunately, including in New York, that was ignored. That's the kind of information. Now, we all know there were doctors, Dr. Ai Feng and also Dr. Li Wenliang. They were significant players. Dr. Li actually wasn't in respiratory medicine, but nonetheless, he played a big role because he circulated a diagnostic result that Dr. Ai Feng had circulated. Both were from Wuhan Central Hospital. This is a different patient, not the one that Dr. Zhao saw. This is a diagnostic result by a Beijing lab. And this diagnostic result simply stated in Chinese, SARS coronavirus. Now, if it's SARS, you better report it because it's by the infectious disease law, it's mandatory reporting, essentially. And you do wonder, right? So sort of in this case, but of course, by then, already multiple cases have been reported and clinical investigation teams were in the field from Hubei province by that point. But this is actually, so there were a number of patients that became very important. I mentioned this particular patient. There is also patient A that Dr. Zhao saw. And that patient had been moved from Wuhan Central Hospital to Tongji Hospital, and then eventually to the infectious Junyan Hospital. In the process, you can imagine how many doctors, how many clinicians were seeing it, how many others were getting involved in the process, because it's clearly not just the hospitals that were involved. The Wuhan Municipal Health Commission was involved, and so on. However, none of those cases was initially reported to the China CDC. Dr. Gao, remember, he had a lot of confidence, but he didn't learn anything from Wuhan, from Hubei directly. He found out about the cases from social media in the evening of December 30th, about probably 10 p.m. or so. Probably before he was just surfing, and then suddenly he saw there's something happening. Remember, by then, actually, clinicians were getting there were quite a number of people who were getting that information. He immediately gets working. Feng Zijian, Deputy Director General, those people were talking. And George Gao, the Director General, contacted the Minister of Health and his office and the Vice Ministers of Health, the National Health Commission. Ma Xiaowei, the minister, was the youngest vice minister during SARS in 2003. He was pretty experienced. So immediately that evening, they began to act. By the morning, I'm not going into a lot of details. There's quite a bit of all those details in the book, but they sent SWAT teams to Wuhan, including a National Health Commission organized team of experts, and also the China CDC's own Emergency Operations Center team, another SWAT team. So they all, actually, they were in Wuhan on the 6:30 flight, basically from Beijing. Still, that's not enough. And Minister Ma decided to send in Liang Wanyan as well, who was a big player in 2003, and he was dispatched to Hubei. And they all do consultations, visits, reviews of each patient, and so on, but with some divisions of labor. And George Gao, the Director General, did not go to Wuhan on December 31st, let me mention. However, he was in Beijing. He was very busy, I can imagine, I can assure you. That morning, in fact, he began to plan a number of things, including how to trace the origins of the virus, which he paid a lot of attention to. But then he went to a lab because, in fact, he had one thing about George Gao is that he had wonderful contacts. He really acted very responsibly during this entire process. He went to see the genomic sequence of the virus at a commercial lab, actually. That evening, December 31st, which is the subject of a chapter in the book, the New Year's Eve meeting, essentially, when those experts, policymakers, and health officials met in the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission, I think it's the 6th floor, they already had multiple cases all gathered at the Wuhan Junyan Hospital. They had all the agreement that the symptoms were SARS-like. They had multiple genomic sequences. In fact, as of December 31st, no fewer than 4 laboratories had genomic sequences of the novel coronavirus, essentially. Interestingly, the commercial labs, none of them directly, the first one, Vision Medicals in Guangzhou, did not want to simply send the diagnostics. They just call you, say, oh, we got those results. We want you to know, but we don't want to officially give you the results, essentially. So you can see the secrecy about this process particularly. There was also a joint investigation report organized by the Hubei and Wuhan Municipal Health Commissions that was done overnight, actually from December 29th to December 30th. And they also saw, but they didn't mention, interestingly, they clearly knew that there was a novel coronavirus involved. You don't find the mention of the novel coronavirus in the report, but the experts knew that it's a novel coronavirus, essentially. And it's in that sense, on December 31st, these experts and health policymakers decided to act. They recommended a series of actions, including the shutting down of the Huanan seafood market, which is a mega marketplace, block-wise, really. So it really, you don't want to shut it down because it's so big, right, in the local economy. And you needed official approval from the Hubei provincial leadership, actually, overnight at that point. So in other words, the conventional wisdom is the virus just arrived. It's such a big surprise, and we were not prepared. And therefore, China delayed, and there was even accusations that China tried to conceal something. What I find instead is there was plenty of information that the experts and policymakers had. They acted promptly and decisively on January 1st. And they took out the SARS playbook as well, actually, with some major differences. So this Health Emergency Response Action Program, with approval from the Wuhan and Hubei provincial leadership, and of course with knowledge by the national health leadership as well, shut down the market. The patients had already been transferred to Jiang and continues to be so, to be sent there. They also began a package of programming, including devising the diagnosis and treatment protocol and other protocols, essentially. Major effort in virus origins tracing. There was also international outreach, including a call by Gaofu to Dr. Ian Lipkin at Columbia University as well, in fact. So I would say that there was a superb start in Wuhan, contrary to what we typically think happened or had been told, essentially. Even though the National Disease Reporting Network was not activated before December 31st, in fact, and even afterward, with some exceptions. And because of that action program, the leaders and the experts thought things were in a good situation. In fact, when I interviewed on January 4th, this is clearly officially orchestrated, Dr. Xu Jianguo, who was the lead expert of the National Health Expert Mission, urged the public, and this is for Hong Kong, to remain rational. And you think about that, actually, it's a sort of basically it's that China has amassed years of experience in infectious disease control, and there will absolutely not be a significant spread during due to the Spring Festival. Actually, it's a sort of now he at that point was becoming the lead expert into the pathogen verification program as well. And then on January 10th, Dr. Xu Jianguo was interviewed again, this time in SARS, in Science, and clearly again this is internationally, this is nationally authorized. And basically he said, no new patients have appeared as far as I understand, and this is a very interesting if you think about it. He basically was not hearing about any new patients It's good news. People fear something like SARS in 2003, but this is a different case. The outbreak is limited. And but we should test patients one by one to identify pneumonia caused by other pathogens and so on. So he was saying, oh, we need to be, he was clearly optimistic. In fact, he would say that if there are no new cases, case closed. We have succeeded in containing the outbreak, essentially. Now, as we all know, the reality cannot be more different. There were major hospitals in Wuhan were getting more and more new cases with similar symptoms, although they were not being brought to Junyan Hospital anymore because they had no exposure to the Huanan seafood market. Moreover, there were at least one hospital, and there may be others. In fact, remember Dr. Zhang Jixian? She thought the situation wasn't under control. But there was one hospital, Junyan Hospital, for example, they had a family. They saw that one of the members of that, one of their patients had no exposure to the Huanan seafood market. And they recognized that the disease was contagious from human to human. They reported the cases to the local health center, the CDCs, but also over time would escalate the reporting all the way to the vice governor of the province. But they were ignored pretty much, actually. None of those suspected cases was reported to Beijing, essentially. At one point, Junyan Hospital even imported 2 cases directly into the disease reporting system. And there were some other cases too by some other hospitals, apparently. And somehow those cases disappeared from the system. So in other words, who had the authority to remove cases from the system? Not the local CDC, not the municipal CDC, or the municipal health commission. The only level that has really the authority to do so would be at the provincial level, to prevent those cases from being reported all the way to Beijing, actually. At the same time, additional laboratories in Wuhan and Shanghai were reporting the identification of novel coronaviruses when the national results were not out. So as a result, it was not until January 20th that Dr. Zhong Nanshan finally reported. Part of the reason was because when that information was not coming from Wuhan, it's experts in Guangdong, in Shanghai, in Thailand, who suspected and who identified human-to-human transmission. And in one case in Shenzhen, for example, in Guangdong, Dr. Yuan Guoyong from Hong Kong, for example, and they identified a family that had one family member who didn't go to Wuhan and realized, oh, this is contagious. They reported the case to, and in Dr. Yuan's case, he also reported not only to Guangdong province, but also to George Gao of the China CDC. And it's George Gao, again, who came to the rescue at that point, because the system in Wuhan, even with central involvement, had become paralyzed in a way you can imagine, because they were missing all those signals. All the signals were being suppressed, to be more exact. And instead, George Gao decided we have to do something because of this external information. There was another team led by Dr. Zhong Nanshan. Dr. Zhong Nanshan, 83 years old at that point, got a call in the morning of January 18th. He basically was told, we would like you to go to Wuhan. But when Dr. Zhong Nanshan said, I'm busy, well, we have cases in Guangdong as well. Zhao Yahui, the Deputy Director General of the National Health Commission, they called him again and basically said, Dr. Zhong, we really need you to come to Wuhan today. And there were no seats available on the trains because it's Lunar New Year time. So they have to make special arrangements to get them on board. And some of you know the famous picture of him sitting in the dining car of the train for Wuhan. So the issue is, with all those signals, how did they miss it? right? So sort of, it's not because the national leadership didn't want to control the outbreak, clearly. It's not because the China CDC didn't want to control the outbreak. And they started very well, actually. So it's in this context, what happened during this interim when they had truly good opportunities to act and to institute community control measures, essentially. So in many ways, this book is about what happened in the interim, this process when outbreak response, which started so well, met with a complex system of health emergency response embedded in the Chinese party state, which unfortunately acted to bottle up and suppress information in Wuhan in particular. And why did it happen that way? And those were the guys in Wuhan, the party secretary of Hubei province, the governor of Hubei province, and in the middle is the party secretary of Wuhan, who is also deputy party secretary of Hubei province, and the mayor of Wuhan, and so on. Incidentally, the vice governor of Hubei province, Yang Junyan, he is directly responsible for health, but he's not a Communist Party member, so his influence is very limited, I can assure you, actually. So sort of, they were the people who drove the process in a way. And those are the health commission leaders in Hubei and also in Wuhan. And in this process, those leaders were very busy at the two sessions, actually, of the People's Congress and People's Consultative Conference for Wuhan and Hubei from the period of January 6th through 17th, actually. While there were a growing number of cases, but those cases that were suspected did not get tested. To put it very simply, well, let me take a look at time. There was really stonewalling, really delays in recognizing those suspected cases. They were not incorporated into the system, as I have mentioned. They were clearly not tested. The excuse, we are waiting for test kits from the China CDC. When Hubei has China's only top-level biosafety laboratory, when Hubei provincial CDC has testing capacity, and when the China CDC had testing capacity, somehow no testing was done on those people who had symptoms, but no exposure at that point. But most importantly, remember some of the cases that were inputted into the system were even removed. There were medical staff that were infected as well. And they were not being reported. In fact, there were multiple teams of experts being dispatched to Wuhan on December 31st from Beijing, on December 10th from Beijing, on January 10th, January 8th, January 9th, the chief epidemiologist of the China CDC, Dr. Zeng Guang, went to Wuhan as well. In this process, there was a growing amount of information, but somehow, and especially the expert team that went to Wuhan, kept on asking, are there medical staff that got infected? They were told no, actually, even though they saw there were more patients with respiratory symptoms in the hospitals and so on at that point. So Dr. Wang Gongfa was one of those experts, actually, so sort of one of the most interesting aspects, remember Dr. Zhang Jixian, was that Dr. Zhang would have told the truth, but somehow when you had this doctor who was officially recognized as the doctor who played such a prominent role, was the leading doctor in reporting cases initially, you would imagine those experts should go to see her, right? Somehow the Beijing experts never got to see her during this period. Actually, they didn't know that she was the first doctor who was reporting the cases. And she would not have been willing to remain silent either. So her hospital wasn't included in the list of hospitals that were visited by the expert teams either. in fact. So this is actually, when you think about this, actually, it's almost like there is some sort of mechanism that's keeping information from reaching the experts from Beijing, essentially. So my understanding, therefore, is to see what are the interests that are involved in this, because China has a fragmented authoritarian system. And for those of you who may not be China experts, one simple fact is the China CDC does not directly control the Hubei provincial CDC, let alone the Wuhan municipal CDC. Each of those CDCs belong to their respective health commissions. So therefore, the health commissions in Hubei, in Wuhan, in the districts directly led those CDCs in the local authorities. They all answered to the local officials. So when the local officials tell them to do certain things, the China CDC has much less leverage. As a result, whether in reporting by Wuhan municipality or in terms of the management of the process, this information came under the influence of the local authorities. And the local authorities clearly had interests in not playing off the outbreak. They like to believe that also the situation was under control. And as they went about holding their conferences and so on, essentially. So sorry, let's see. Oh, I see. So this is the situation, and you can see this red. Somehow you see a different color there. In terms of really talking about how the student, all those officials, they like to see things. No bad news is wanted at that particular moment. So that's the basic situation that I described in great detail, trying to understand what was happening essentially and why we had this particular problem in getting information reported. And then finally, the experts from Beijing on January 19th, finally they get to Wuhan. Dr. Zhong asks all their medical staff infected. He asked the vice mayor in charge of health in Wuhan, point blank. Imagine the relief for the vice mayor who has been keeping all that information away, bottled up, and probably was under tremendous pressure himself as well. He said there were 13 medical doctors and staff members that were already infected. And you can imagine there were already 13, there were probably more, right? And that's only medical doctors. So in other words, it's no longer the language that was used about, oh, was there human-to-human transmission? It's no longer, it's never been about human-to-human transmission for the experts. The reason was for example, for George Gao, he later revealed that they believe there must be human-to-human transmission from the get-go. The issue is how efficient, that's the word that he liked to use, there was human-to-human transmission. He assumed that if the virus had jumped from an animal, it may take time for it to become efficient. So therefore, they can relax a little. They don't have to be responding as aggressively, but they were waiting for the cases to come. But the cases were being kept in Hubei. They were not being reported. And as a result, there was that huge delay. And of course, it's the politics that interfered with the transmission. But at the same time, Gao Fu and others at the China CDC were stuck in what I would call the epidemiological tunnel vision, that they thought the virus had jumped from an animal or some animals in the Huanan seafood market. It would take time for it to become efficient in transmission. And therefore, and of course, especially since there are no new cases that are being reported, things were under control. So they don't have to be worried as much. And they were looking. The big problem was that they were looking for patients with exposure to the Huanan seafood market. They shut down the market, so there were no new patients with exposure to the seafood market. There were, however, patients with no exposure to the seafood market, but who had the same symptoms. Somehow there was a disconnect that they didn't test or they didn't realize that those patients were the canaries in the coal mine that they should have dealt with from the beginning. Again, I deal with that. And how come there was such a basic mistake that was made from the very beginning, right, in a way. And as a result, essentially, there was very strong, big puzzles about scientific and health emergency leadership throughout this process. And so this was finally the overnight, the evening of January 19th at the National Health Commission. You can see the clock on the wall is 10 minutes to midnight. They were meeting after visiting Wuhan, getting ready for the reporting to the State Council, to the Premier's office in the morning. And they were also deciding on the recommendations to make, actually. The next day they meet, they decide this is a new disease, not SARS, not SARS-like, a novel coronavirus, and that's the emphasis. And therefore, it needed to be treated like this, and they get Dr. Zhong, instead of the National Health Commission making a big announcement, they got Dr. Zhong Nanshan to do their work and say, oh, there was human-to-human transmission, actually. And 3 days later, Wuhan was under lockdown, essentially. I think actually, I think I should stop here, given the time. I could continue, obviously, but I think it's best that I stop here. And at the same time, I want to thank you for your attention. And I think I have written a book that should be read, so I encourage you to read the book.
Well, thank you, Professor Yang, for such a scintillating talk, and give us a lot of details about this intricate process of how the virus started and how the local authorities failed to manage it. Now we will have Professor Li to give her his discussing remarks on the book. And I should also mention that Professor Li, I think you're also personally very interested in the issue of COVID, and you even taught a class on COVID politics during the pandemic. So
thank you very much, Dali and Junyan. I haven't Yeah, let me begin. My remarks mostly focus on the presentation. I have the book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure I will spend a lot of time to read it, reading it. I think I want to start with the importance of your book, your work on this, or in general. That I think it's. I want to start with a personal experience. I was quite. I was active. I was on Weibo for many years, from 2011 to about 2019, actually. 2020 was eventually shut down in March of that year. Well, the reason is because I was, I followed the events on the Weibo until about late January, early February. It was still quite vibrant, a lot of information. No wonder that Gaofu learned that, George Gao learned that from that. But later on, the information was basically shut down. My account was shut down because I had some comments. And interestingly, I was I also was in a WeChat group with it's called some Chinese political scientists and public administration specialist. It's called the China Public Safety kind of expert on that. I don't know if you want it. It's about 150. I actually posted, I think on January 24th, about my quick comments about 8 points. Sort of, we should follow that. Encourage the scholars in China to follow this, is because I sense this is a big kind of event that really would test China's, bureaucracy and public policy response at the kind of things. That's 24th. And then yesterday I was looking back, it's completely gone. I mean, with my comments. So I was trying to think about 8 points. So here brings my main point is that now it turned out that after the COVID, it's very different from after the SARS. It seems after SARS, actually there was earnest intent by the government to improve on the disease response. Hence they set up this, enhance the power of CDC, authority of CDC, and it started the National Disease Surveillance Network, as you point out. But this time it's quite different. This time is not only you don't want to turn the page. I say it's actually using a phrase, if you want to burn the book. Literally, you don't see anything. There's nothing about you comment on your main point about this, early response. There's reveals several fatal flaws. I mean, fatal, critical, because it really costs lives. That system that should, really the system had. But then none of discussion of that, unlike the first SARS 10 plus years ago. So I think this is very dangerous. And this is critical, again, because it involves, lives in the future. So I think that's why I said the work like yours and other scholars like Guo Binyang and others, Fang Fang, all add to this historical, I think is very important analysis for a political science point of view. It's also very important to expose and to analyze the kind of flaws that system exist that would possibly affect the next public health emergency such as this. So there are 2 points I got from your sort of remarks. It's about main one. It's about information flow. It's one of your last. I think it's quite critical. And the picture you painted, which I think is quite vivid and quite convincing, is that the flow really reflect the first. There are 2 major flaws. I think the critical flaws the system has. One is that you point out the fragmented authoritarianism, the central-local kind of relationship, the Tiaokuai conflict that's been bothering, challenging, the regime for a long time, not the Chinese communist regime, but even before that. How in a centralized unitary system you handle this kind of information from far away, right? From the battle, your first book on Great Leap Forward, the disaster of Great Leap Forward, in part is to be blamed for this kind of no information flow problem as well. That's kind of start, at least in the CCP era. But so that flaw is still there, and that played a huge role in that. If we see that, we don't get into detail of it, but I think is quite important to point out. The second part I thought you just mentioned, but you didn't quite focus on, is the flow of information. The other direction is from the government to the public. The couple of incidences I sort of caught my eye. I thought it was quite important. One is the interview by Xu Jianguo, who is not. It's quite interesting. The choice of interviewee is also who will be the public face. From the very beginning, you see a lot of changes. Right, Gao Fu was very much later. Zhong Nanshan was January 28th, June 20th, and later disappeared. And then it's all become Liang Wannian, and later is Wu Zunyou. So it keeps changing. That is critical. I think it's very intentional because because they know the public face reflects the urgency of the problem. So they chose Xu. I thought it's also because they have a internal problem built in, which I blame the system itself that built that. And that is the moral hazard problem of information such as this, right? Because in Chinese authoritarian system, there is this problem of how much public should know, right? Ordinarily, a lot of information is secret. As you point out that, even the information from the private lab, they don't want to give you the formal reporting. They want because information is, in the market economy, it's money. It's also a lot of things. There's a politics behind it. So information control becomes a habit, right? Generally, the information, first of all, is not open, and then maybe open. Right, so that's the kind of instinct built into this information control, and that created a problem for the public as well, because public generally in ordinary times, public not knowing it's okay because it doesn't affect their life, right? Or Wuhan has some sort of disease, but when it comes to this kind of public information, public health emergency, which possibly touch on the everybody's life, then it becomes a problem. That information control, how much you want to know. And I see in the beginning, at least in early January, there's a struggle. So they sent Xu Jianguo to be the front face, and they had an interview in in 大公报, not in Chinese official media, but it's a media semi kind of official voice. So you wanted that information a little bit sifted. And that's already itself shows that in the beginning, they don't know how much they want it because they don't want to cause panic. There is that because it's coming, they don't want to cause panic. They don't have information. So you see that struggle. But I see that also has that moral hazard problem because from the public, that they learned that if someone like Golf Wu or someone is speaking to the public, that must be very serious, for better or worse, right? So they don't want, they want to avoid that already built-in problem the system had. Yet that's also, I think, in part affected how they reacted. So those information flow from lower down to up that affected. And also I see because one of the result of this lack of public information in the beginning is that very soon the issue becomes politicized. We haven't really talked about that. And that makes the kind of information even more tend to be controlled by the government. Because by January 24th also that time, already the public quite trying to say, where did they come from? See, that also affect later how the U.S. react to that. There's all kinds of politicization going on by late January. Because if I remember still in Weibo, already there appeared, you mentioned about this military games. Very interesting. I actually learned that they actually had exercise for that. That's very interesting. But did they have that similar access for any other Olympic games? Why is in Wuhan they had that? That's also why 19. But anyway, that aside, that conspiracy theory from China already began to throw in about third week of January, because they already say, oh, this is brought in by the American. They did. That's the sort of early conspiracy on the Chinese side. A lot of people forgot about that side. Yes, because they couldn't believe that because the game was happened in October. I think October, late October, sometime of there in Wuhan, which American participated. So that's another way that's the early way. So, but anyway, so control of information gave rise to all kinds of rumors. This has happened not just now, even the Mao's era. That's the problem because people has no, sort of formal way to get formal correct information. Then disinformation would appear. Now with the social media, that happens even more. So that makes this whole initial kind of control information flow that much also add to that initial failure of the response or whatever you can call that. And later the handling of that, of course, affected how international reaction to that, right? Because there's also that international watch of this whole information flow. So those are the 2 points I want to make. I'm sure that maybe in your book you might mention that.
Great. Well, Professor Yang, would you like to respond briefly, and then we'll open up?
Those are really great comments. Really, actually, to sort of cover some of the most interesting aspects. And I think, especially, I like it would be great to talk some more about, for example, who was the public face. I do mention, for example, part of the reason, one of the interesting aspects is that Zheng Guang, the chief epidemiologist, in terms of leadership, actually the official name is not exactly chief epidemiologist. He's the chief scientist for the Communicable Diseases, Infectious Diseases Institute. He actually had retired in 2019, but they hadn't arranged for a replacement for him. So he continued to hold that position, but at the same time, he wasn't going to the office much. And of course, when the situation happened for example, in Wuhan, he wasn't going to Wuhan until much later. So there are some of those kind of factors that's interesting. So Xu Jianguo, partly because he is the head of the state key laboratory for the China CDC. So that's why he became the lead and also an academician. So he has the prestige to be the the lead specialist. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The original interview was intended for Hong Kong and for overseas. But at the same time, Gao Fu was on the phone talking to, for example, his friends. So that was the international outreach, essentially. By the way, Zhang Dingyu, the president of Wuhan Jiang Hospital, did later on, in response to the conspiracy theory about the Wuhan military games, to emphasize that there were some athletes who got sick in Wuhan, but they had malaria. So he actually officially tried to address the public concerns. One of the most interesting aspects is throughout the first 3 weeks, Gao Fu didn't say a single word in public. He's talkative. He likes to talk, by the way. So you do wonder about all the thoughts that had gone into this process in arranging for who gets to speak to represent the China CDC in particular, and why, actually. Yeah, the other aspect is Weibo is remarkable because I do emphasize also there is a chapter really talking about how the aspects and also in particular the crackdowns on the doctors. Now, what's interesting is when Dr. Li Wenliang, who got so much attention, right, to sort of the police announced the crackdowns before they had started crackdowns. So then they had to find people to crack down. Actually, so Dr. Li Wenliang wasn't sure whether he belonged to one of the 8 people, incidentally. So in other words, there was a serious effort at the provincial level, at least, organized to send a message to the communities, basically saying that you should not circulate information, and so on. So that was so. On January 1st, they began to air on national television. So you can see the coordination between the local and the national. So again, it's very interesting in this regard. So I do want to add one final point in terms of the circulation of information, because on the one hand, the national, I discussed this at some length because the disagreements between the provincial and the national, the struggle in some ways, the tensions became very public between the provincial and the National Health Commission. In the beginning, the National Health Commission emphasized this is local responsibility, you should handle it. And yet, they stationed a vice minister in Wuhan beginning on January 1st. So for the locals, clearly they saw this is a national leadership. And the public announcements were vetted by the national authorities. But the national authorities, however, said, this is your responsibility. And on January 19th, however, the municipal authorities pointedly made a public statement, basically saying, we are doing a great job. And we follow the leadership of the national leadership, and so on. And then that evening, the National Health Commission also issued its own statement talking about their respective responsibilities and so on. So it actually was very public in terms of what each party was thinking, because it's not what is on paper, it's what behind that statement in each time that really matters. Because at that point, January 19th, everybody knew the situation was getting dire. They all wanted to shift responsibility, but each claimed, however, that they were doing a great job nonetheless. And then the leadership was theirs, not ours, and so on.
Great. Okay, now let's open it up. If there's any questions from the audience, raise your hand. Make sure you use a mic.
Yeah, okay. Well, Dali, thanks very much for this very engaging presentation. So I agree that there is blocked information flow and the government may not be as efficient as we wished they were. But thinking about the timeline from the beginning, you said the first case reported in early December to lockdown in late January, so only about 5 or 6 weeks particularly given that lockdown is really unprecedented. When it first happened, it was totally unimaginable. I would not believe that would happen. So talking about that, I think Chinese government would be more efficient than US government or government in Europe. So in many ways, think about if this happened in New York City or in Paris. So if say the government want to just shut down the farmers market in Union Square, so how that would happen? It's just very unfortunate that the case happened in Wuhan rather than another big city elsewhere. But if that happened, I would not think our government can be more efficient than the Chinese government.
Yeah, that's a great question. In many ways, it's clear most governments would not have had handled a development like this very well initially, right? There are always going to be some problems in initial, and especially an incredibly contagious virus, although the virus was less contagious in the beginning than with the let's keep in mind with Omicron and so on, right? Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and I asked myself very hard about this question in the process of completing the book. Now, as I mentioned, China, of course, had 2 novel coronavirus attacks in 17 years, right? And by the time of 2019, essentially, SARS was still looming large on the minds of clinicians, health leaders. They all had experiences, in fact, with SARS. The Chinese public, if you tell them it's SARS related, you don't need, they are not going to be like Michigan residents revolting in the streets. They all pay attention. They all stay away, right? So I don't think you need to lock down a city, actually, but you need to let the public know because the Chinese public are willing to be cooperative. If you tell them it's something, I mean, it's not like there wasn't exactly the information. It may not be officially verified information, but this is no longer 2003. Genomic sequencing is pretty easy nowadays, right? So, and of course, they were quarantining quite a number of people, though, in the very beginning. So it's not, so China could do more quarantining if needed. They can certainly close down certain neighborhoods. Right? That shouldn't be a problem. So number one, the first easy thing is that if they had told people, clearly the number of people who died in Wuhan would be much less. Right? So sort of because the people in Wuhan would have been willing to, if they had been told, you really need to act. In fact, initially, they did tell people, oh, you should wear face masks and so on. And then they began to say, no problem, you don't. In fact, in Wuhan Central Hospital, they get people like Dr. Li Wenliang to work on the front lines, but also discourage them from wearing face masks. Right? So sort of it's almost like a form of punishment, essentially. But at the same time, so that's why in Wuhan Central Hospital, there are quite a number of doctors who died, and not just Dr. Li Wenliang. So my sense is clearly that would have worked. But also in the beginning, in particular, the circulation of the virus was fairly limited geographically at that point, potentially. Now, there is a third aspect to this, because I'm thinking, well, number one, this is such a multi-trillion-dollar issue, right? So even if it's a relatively modest chance, it's still a significant issue that we should pay attention to. But going forward, what could have been done better? So number one is clearly there is the need to level with the public, right? And so on, and of course, other capabilities. But couldn't China really make that disease reporting network work? Not reporting a SARS related, I mean, it's remarkable how every excuse was found not to put data into that network, essentially. And people were playing hardball with the law, but clearly in reforms, there is some need. If that network was working, we could imagine there could have been cases, probably PUE cases reported earlier. I'm thinking 2 weeks earlier, but 1 week is almost assured because already we had the first novel coronavirus diagnosis by December 27th. And that's what we do know today. And I can almost be sure that there must be information I still don't know as well that insiders may know. So I think actually when in the ideal situation, clearly, so there could much more could be done. But if you ask me, oh, could you be certain that the pandemic could be avoided? I'm not making that such a suggestion. But I do make the argument that if people are given the power to act and so on, there is a meaningful chance that something could be done, and that in fact the pandemic could have been actually significantly averted. In fact, but at the same time, I do recognize, like you, that the Chinese government, when it did come, the time came, acted pretty decisively under pressure, but still pretty decisive in Wuhan. But by then, of course, for those of you, some of you may know, the total number of people who were infected in Wuhan eventually was about 750,000 or so, based on several surveys and so on. So clearly, that number could have been significantly decreased in the first of all, and moreover, we can talk about other possibilities. There's a hand over there. Right here. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I know this isn't the focus of your interests, but did you delve into the lab leak theory in your research? Do you give it credence, and what do you find interesting about the way that theory is presented in the West and dismissed in China?
Well, the book itself doesn't address that issue, but I'm open to possibilities. Let me simply say. Now, the way I think about it, just to think out aloud, is that part of the reason the lab leak theory was abetted was actually by the Wuhan authorities themselves. At one point in February, the National People's Congress of China issued a decision banning the consumption of illegal wildlife. Clearly, initially, that was the official understanding of what happened, right? The assumption of all the actions in Wuhan and also by the China CDC. However, the Wuhan authorities felt that having Wuhan people consuming illegal wildlife isn't great to be known. So they denied that there was such, right? It's not until 2022 that there was a significant study by Chinese scientists that actually finally was published, revealing that in multiple wet markets, there were multiple species of wild animals that were on sale and so on at different times. And clearly there was a thriving market for all sorts of animals that could have been susceptible to a coronavirus, actually. So we clearly should not rule out the virus jumping from some animal sources. I think for some people who are arguing that, what about, I think at this point it's almost clear that nobody is saying that this was a totally bioengineered virus anymore, right? So the only possibility people think about is, what about there are 2 or 3 labs in Wuhan that had collected samples. So could the virus have leaked from such a lab? I don't think anyone can fully eliminate that possibility, because very likely it's not detected when the leak happened, right? It's not a deliberate leak. So therefore, but what are the chances in a way, clearly, so we can do some calculations. There are just multiple markets in Wuhan and in outlying areas as well. And there are just many more people who get exposure to such animals. And we do know that coronaviruses exist in the wild in many different variants and so on. And that there are animals that are trafficked from Southwest China or Southeast Asia into China, and Wuhan happens to be a hub. So I think clearly, if you suspect a lab leak, it's hard to rule out the zoonosis version. But of course, for people like Gaofu who did studies of the environmental samples, the China CDC incidentally didn't fully collect samples initially. By the time they began to collect samples, it's been some time. So therefore, even with viruses, they decay very rapidly. And interestingly, the China CDC collects human samples, environmental samples, not animal samples initially, because that's the animal CDC's job. So clearly they didn't have the perfect sample. So their conclusion is we don't know how the virus got into the, so they published the latest, all the data they find is they cannot pin down exactly the virus came from. And they are very open in a way, actually. So sort of, if you think about it, of course, after some public debate as well. So that's where I can share with you. I don't, therefore I'm open, but if you really push me, part of the reason people argue that this virus may have been leaked is because this virus seems to be much more efficient, but it also has been mutating very rapidly. So you can make the arguments one way or another. But if I were to bet, I would still bet on the wild animals, but I would say that I can't rule out every other possibilities, but it's not my job, it's the scientist's job now.
Mark, before you, I just want to quickly respond to that. I mean, comment on that. Yeah. It's interesting to see, I mean, again, from Dali's sort of investigation, I find one piece, again, really fascinating. That is, Wuhan had an exercise, you know, because the upcoming military games. So what I'm in July in that year, that is the first time I heard it. So what I'm trying to, because I follow online the conspiracy theory on both sides, how that appears. I think one of the reasons why conspiracy theory, you know, usually, and not just on this case, is that there's so many coincidences. It's hard to explain. So in this case, you asked about the lab. Well, they happen to have a lab, right? At but what is it? The bio 4 level 4, level 3 bio lab. Had this happened in Beijing, well, say Guangzhou, where there's no lab, and that would be much, you know, it would be that one. And then on the Chinese side, they had the military. I didn't know where that come from. I just thought, okay, they had a military games, but you know, China hosted a lot of international events. Then, if that's the case, and then it was, if I'm a conspiracy, that is hard to explain. Why do they have that prior knowledge to take exercise on that? And that's not common in China either. So my point is that there are a lot of coincidences that sometimes happens that hard to explain. Hence, it doesn't mean that there is always the good explanation, but that it just happens, coincidence. It could be. I'm just saying that.
Thanks for this terrific presentation. It's the best that I've ever heard in Columbia seminars over the years. And you pose such incredibly difficult and important questions, and some of what I'm going to ask you've started to answer now. But I don't think in the end you do answer. Why? Why did this happen? Why did they allow this to happen? Why did they make it happen? Why did they overdetermine that it would happen with such disastrous results? And there are some things floating around that point to possible answers, but I'm not sure that you've told us how you quite think it through yourself. I mean, because what's so impressive about the analysis is here's all the data, here are the possibilities of other kinds of outcomes, and yet the results are disastrous. Well, you mentioned 700,000 people got the disease. How many died? And obviously this, and so my question is, how do we in fact understand the set of decisions? Now, obviously it's about control of information, among other things. Obviously it's protecting the state, protecting the party, protecting the top of the party, and so on. And yet the results are quite contrary to that, since people have to see, I think people have to see, maybe they don't, people have to see that this is a disaster that is politically manufactured as well as a result of a horrible disease situation. So I'm wondering whether you can be pushed further to, in fact, offer an explanation. Does this, you know, does this weaken the party to have a disaster of this kind, or do people say, after all, well, they did their best and things happen?
A great set of questions. I'm sure you're familiar with the saying that revolutions are impossible before the revolutions. They are inevitable after they have happened. Right? So therefore, in a way, it's useful to keep that in mind as we look at any historical events, and which is why also I have been painstaking, but also tell it actually in the sense that we are all human. In fact, the people in China, of course, they have their self-interest, and I explain why they were motivated to behave in certain ways depending on their positions. But at the same time, they were also human in that. Now, in terms of why did it happen, clearly there are elements that are systemic that predetermine actually some of the responses. But part of the reason I hold China to a higher standard here, and this goes back to Professor Sung's comment and question, is that China had developed the capabilities, had announced that it would like to be able to prevent such occurrences. And it also had the historical experiences and also a society that had the historical experiences to comply with such demands, but they missed it. It's sort of in a way. So this is why I feel like, I mean, if some other country, let's say with very underdeveloped health systems like China in 2003, I would feel like, oh, it happened and because it wasn't ready. But here we have a system that was primed to stop something like this, and yet it still happened. So sort of, and I think a lot of it is really about, of course, there are misjudgments, missteps, and a lot of those missteps could have been alleviated by having greater transparency and also good leadership. And but of course, that leadership tended to be compromised in such circumstances when there is actually this very complex hierarchy. But of course, as we all have experience, whether in New York or Chicago or Washington, right? So sort of good leadership is hard to come by in very urgent situations. So I recognize actually so sort of some of the limitations in a way. Did this weaken the party? In the short run, for a couple of weeks, yes. And then by the spring of 2020, China was able to control the virus in Wuhan, and nationally, while New York and others were struggling. So this was, we were mentioning this earlier, is during this process, the sense of confidence, the hubris in China reached sky high. By 2021, the phrase, the East is rising, West is declining, I would say the sentiment was the East is rising rapidly, the West was declining fast. That's how people felt in China. And of course, it was clearly good for the party, for the leadership in that circumstances until, of course, about a year ago, right, when finally China opened up and the economy didn't recover as quickly. And of course, the Chinese people, and there are also, again, we can review some of the decisions, right? The decision to stick to inactivated virus vaccines, the decision not to prepare the public in advance for the exit, the decision really basically to unleash a tsunami to accelerate it through the Chinese population. And that didn't help the party. I say we can continue clearly.
Your mentioning of the US case is interesting. The US had this disaster and there's been no blame, just a million people and we just go on and it never had political reverberations.
Well, we did have a change in the presidency, but we can talk later at that point. It's sort of but I really enjoy the questions. Yeah, I think it's over maybe.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question. You mentioned that during the Lianghui period, the two-session period, like the information, like the government basically didn't want any like bad news. So, how much do you think like 两会, the 2-session period, like contribute to the block of information flow? Like, is it more of a structural problem? For example, like even if it took place in June or like September, the same thing will happen, or like it's more of like a bad timing, like at this time, like 两会 period was like at this time. So yeah.
Yeah, this is the question is really about to what extent the political annual meetings in the city of Wuhan and also in the province of Hubei, where Wuhan is located, affect decisions at the local level. And also, we need to keep in mind there was the China's the Lunar New Year looming as well. And of course, clearly there was I discussed quite a bit of clearly it had an impact. But of course, this is where the leadership would have mattered. When the municipal People's Congress was held, I know that there was, for example, a delegate to the municipal People's Congress basically told the leadership, oh, we have something like this. Should we suspend the conference? And the leadership said, no, we don't. It turned out when they held these meetings, they were very lucky. Actually, for the municipal People's Congress meetings, they met fairly close. The hotels were not too far from the railway station, so they just got incredibly lucky. Actually, in there, but it also shows because the initial cases tended to be people who are working class, who were actually working in the Huanan seafood market or living in the surrounding areas, instead of the elite, right? So sort of, so there is actually a class element, but at the same time, the political elite just kept going. And at the same time, whether directly or they simply said, oh, let's try to protect the political environment. And of course, the party secretary of the Hubei Provincial Health Commission, who had a lot of influence in this process, understood that. Oh, okay, well, let's keep. And of course, part of the reason is also, this is where there's a lot of shucking going on. I'm doing my job. He does his job. But they were also, so the Wuhan people were waiting for the China CDC to come up with the test. It turned out the China CDC was taking the time to perfect the test. And then they contract the test manufacturing to firms in Shanghai and so on. So there are all sorts of things that are happening. Incidentally, in Shenzhen, the hospital didn't wait for the China CDC to come up with the test. They just did their own test kits, and one hospital in Wuhan on January 1st or so got the SARS test. And they ordered some placed some emergency orders for the SARS test. And the virus tested positive for SARS, actually. So in other words, it's a matter of, this is a lot of judgment that was involved, but I do think actually the 2 sessions had a heavy influence.
So we are hitting the 1:30 mark. So maybe one more question, one last question here.
Thank you, Professor Yang. I just want to start with a perspective from the grassroots level, especially I think you mentioned in the book about great style management. This kind of real great managers, to my perspective, my personal experience, I think they at the grassroots level is at a horrible unpreparedness for this kind of pandemic on prevention, and especially arrangement, coordination across coordination with other kind of sectors to quarantine people, to coordinate different kind of patients to another kind of sites. Like they lack such kind of coordination, and they do not have the kind of collective platform at the initial stage. But for the great style management, they do have a kind of system of reporting and collecting all this kind of information from the society. But when a pandemic happens, all this kind of used platforms, multiple platforms, seems not to be very useful or to harnessed by those kind of grassroots workers to be responsive to any kind of this kind of arrangements. So how would you regard this kind of grassroots level unpreparedness?
Well, that's a great comment. I do have chapters discussing the situation in the lockdown, because the conventional wisdom about the lockdown in Wuhan is China announced the lockdown is implemented. But actually, I really worked through the disarray, the stress, the challenges facing local levels. I mean, it's a severe test for any society, including in Wuhan. And you would expect, and clearly I find a lot of stress initially, absolutely. But at the same time, I do want to mention from the very beginning, though, the leading hospitals, their respiratory sections, they actually started, the leading hospitals did very well. And they also, for example, in Tongji and so on, they protected their own physicians incredibly well, actually. So you do see and of course, in the beginning also, when any patients is transferred to Wuhan Municipal, to the Jintan Hospital, it actually coordinated through the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission. So they have that capacity. Wuhan is not just any city, it's a very significant city in China. But at the local level, clearly, yeah, there were a lot of issues. And of course, it took time, and eventually the leadership of Hubei and Wuhan, the party secretary, was sacked, they were replaced, new leaders were brought in. And I described in some detail actually about the efforts to regain. So essentially, lockdowns in China are efforts to control society, right? And at the extreme level, demobilize society, get them to stay at home and don't get out, right? But you need to be able to support them. But there is, I do want to end by saying that there is a difference, because in Wuhan, they didn't immediately really succeed in lockdown, right? They were not very good actually initially. So that gave time for the population to adjust. So they would buy stuff, by the time there was really lockdown, there were complaints, but overall, though, starvation and so on wasn't as a big issue. Shanghai did much better in doing the lockdown. And as a result, millions of people went hungry at one point. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, I mean, wishes, this session would be longer, and Professor Yang could also answer all of our questions, but unfortunately, we have a time limit. So, please join me in thanking Professor Yang for a great talk. If you want to know more, come to talk to Professor Yang or buy the book, more importantly. And so thank you all for coming.